Hi everyone. So this is one of the first photos I've taken with my brand new Lensbaby Velvet 56 lens, and so I thought I'd just take you through how I'm going to edit it. I'm absolutely in love with this lens, in love with this portrait. So yeah, just thought I'd share my editing process with you. I am going to start in Lightroom as I always do, and then take it into Photoshop and just do some tidying up. You can see here she's oops, it's going a bit too close up. She's caked her makeup a little bit in a couple of spots. I'm not quite sure what the story is with the makeup. I've had a few questions about that on Instagram, people wondering if it's some kind of special cultural thing. It's not. I think it's probably inspired by Disney Zombie. She's a little bit obsessed at the moment with watching makeup tutorials on YouTube, and this is my very expensive MAC eye pencil that you can see all over her face. So I took this, as I said, with my Lensbaby Velvet 56. It doesn't show you, because it's a manual lens, it doesn't actually speak to my Canon EOS R camera. So it doesn't actually tell you in Lightroom what the aperture was, but I think my aperture for this one was f5. It might have been f5.6. And as you can see, my ISO was 640 and my shutter speed was 1/200. She was standing in the doorway facing outside in the sort of glass sliding doors. So there was some lovely front light giving her those catch lights in her eyes. And because it's darker in the room behind her, obviously it's sort of given, sort of obscured the distractions in the background. I'm going to darken, just burn this little patch of light behind her. There's a little bit of a distraction there, probably in Lightroom, but we'll just see as we go. And then, as I said, I'm going to clean up some of the mess she's made with the, the extra makeup, and just really sort of sharpen up these eyes and get them nice and shiny. So I'm going to start, as I always do, by applying a base preset in Lightroom. The reason I do this is because it helps to keep my tones consistent, and I use this base preset on pretty much everything, whether it's people, whether it's landscape, whether it's macro, just to keep my tones and nice and consistent. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump over here, and the one that I use on everything is called Emma No Matte. Now it's actually a hybrid of a couple of other presets which I had bought. As you can see up here, I have quite a collection of different presets that I've purchased over the years, but this is like I've put it together using some of the elements from different presets that I've bought that worked really well. I couldn't find one that was a one-click solution for what I wanted. So obviously you can see now that I've added, because the preset that I use adds a lot of contrast, it has made this image quite a lot darker, even though my initial exposure was fairly close. So I'm going to just bring my exposure up to start with quite a bit, just to, it'll also get rid of that red muddiness off her face. I think I'm going to go, I don't want to go too far because I don't want to, I'm just going to bring the highlights down a little bit just to, yeah, just so she's not too white and glary. So I think I like that for the exposure. I'm just going to go through the panel. I like to pretty much nix all the highlights out of my images and then bring the shadows up if I need to, because that's just how I like to shoot. I like a really dark, moody kind of feel. Coming down to the tone curve, and then the changes in this HSL panel, these are really what give me the consistency, like I said, because I apply these changes across all of my images. Occasionally I will go in there and tinker a bit. If I've got a lot of greens in an image, I will go in, especially if they're throwing yellow, and tinker with the saturation and the luminance and the hue on the greens and the yellows, just to tone down the yellow from the greens. But in this particular image, I don't need to do that. And the other area that helps me keep my tones nice and consistent is the split tones. I have a little formula that I use for my shadows and a little formula that I use for my highlights, and that again, like I said, helps to keep consistency through the tones in the whole image. I do also build a little bit of noise reduction. There wasn't a huge amount of noise reduction, a huge amount of grain in this image, because my EOS R is brilliant at handling high ISOs. I think I've pushed it to 10,000 and still had relatively usable quality images. So at ISO 640, there isn't much grain, but I do like to just build a little bit in while I'm going. So that's basically all I'm going to do in Lightroom before I jump over into Photoshop. So I'm going to jump up here. I'm going to go Photo, Edit in, Adobe Photoshop. Here we go. It's going to open up over here. Sometimes it takes a bit of a minute. I've been getting some scratch disk errors on my Photoshop, so I've just moved everything to, like all of my scratch disks to my hard drive to try and speed things up a little bit. All right, so here we go, sitting in Lightroom. The first thing in Photoshop, the first thing I'm going to do is just tidy up these little patches of sort of makeup. I'm going to leave, obviously, all of this glorious some people thought were hieroglyphics, but they're actually, when I asked her, just dots on her nose. I'm going to leave all that. I'm going to leave the little splotches under her eyes. To me, that's part of the story in this image. But I just want to just do something about this dark patch here and maybe a little bit of this black pencil where she spilt it over here. So to do that, I'm going to go Layer, New, Layer via Copy, which you can use Control-J. That's the keyboard shortcut for. And then I'm going to start by grabbing the heal tool. Because this is quite close up and because there's quite a lot of texture in her skin, sometimes the heal tool removes a bit too much of the texture and I might need to clone that back in. But we'll just see how we go with the heal tool to start with. It's the reason we do this on a duplicate layer is because then that gives us the option to either delete it or undo things bit by bit without having to make changes to our base image. So I'm just going to try with the heal tool here, just see if that's going to give me what I want. I'm not sure that it is. Zoom out. So that's gotten rid of the darker patch, but as I mentioned, it has actually removed all of the texture and I can see a bit of an edge around there, which I don't like. It's not really blending very well with her skin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, just use the heal tool to get rid of this little bit of black over here, which shouldn't be such a big deal because this is slightly blurred anyway and there's less texture here. So I'm just going to get rid of that. See how that looks when I switch it off. Yep, that's much better. I'm much happier with that. And then I'm going to come back and do a bit more work over here by grabbing my clone tool over here. It's probably a bit big. Just make it a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to, not quite that small. And then I'm just going to go Alt click to select the texture that I want to clone over it. I'm just going to paint this down over, you can see where it's removed the texture from her skin. That's just allowing some of that texture to, allowing me to put some of the texture back into her skin that has been taken out. Because the idea is to make it look natural, not to make it look like I've healed out makeup off her face. And this is quite a fiddly, like I probably, if I was, no, I've overdone it there, undo. I would probably spend more time like being finicky and perfecting this, but I'm not going to spend hours doing it while you're all watching because you've got the idea of how the technique works and like I said, you don't need to sit and watch me do this all day. So I'm just, rather than striving for perfection, going to strive for good enough for this particular image. All right, I'm fairly happy. You can see that's gotten rid of all of that darkness there, and it still retains some of the texture in her skin. As I said, I'd probably pay more attention to the detail, but I don't want you to sit around and watch me cloning for ages. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to flatten that just to give me a nice flat image to work on. And I'm going to go into my actions over here. Now I have, first of all I'm going to add a texture. In fact, I'm going to go File, place embedded. I'm going to go to my hard drive, which is where all my assets are stored. I'm going to open up my textures, and I know which one I'm going to use on here already. The idea with the texture is just to add a little bit more depth to the image. I'm going to go with this one because it's going to give me the darkness on this side, which is where I am trying to get rid of that little bit of distraction in the background behind her. So I've just gone place to pop that on there. I'm going to change my blend mode to soft light. And then, as you can see, that's just darkened this over here. I don't want the actual texture itself though, so I'm just going to click to accept that, and then I'm going to go with this layer selected up here to filter, blur, and then choose Gaussian blur. Oh, no, wrong one. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And you can see I've got that set to 100 pixels because I want to blur all of the texture. I don't want to keep any of it. I'm going to go OK. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the texture to black and white, because as you can see when I turn this off, it's made her face go really orange, and I don't really want it to necessarily be that orange. So I'm going to, actually, am I going to turn it to black and white? Or am I just going to reduce the opacity maybe? If I reduce the opacity to about 70%, because I don't want to, yeah, it's a balancing act. Yes, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a brush, I'm going to pop a layer mask on here, and then I'm going to grab a black brush because I'm going to brush the layer off her face. I'm going to bring, I don't want to brush all of it off, I want to keep a tiny bit of that warmth on her face, so I am going to bring the opacity down to 50% on my brush. I'm going to increase the size of my brush because I want it to be nice and big and soft. And then I'm just going to brush some of that texture off her face, which will help to have her not be quite so bright yellow. I'm also going to take it off a little bit down here on her skin and just make that brush a bit smaller to remove it from the patch of her arm that's oh, not quite that small, from the patch of her arm that's showing over here. So there we go. All right, so now if I turn that off, you can see the difference. There's a tiny bit of the yellow sort of glow left on her face. You can see over here that on the layer mask where I brushed it off her face, there's a couple of patches where I can probably give it another going over. Just making the brush a bit bigger, just to see. Yep, I'm pretty happy with that. All right, so the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to just use some levels and some curves layers to try and brighten her up a little bit, add a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to go click the little circle icon down here to choose, excuse me, to choose levels. And just to brighten her up a little bit, I'm just going to bring this one up a tiny bit, up to about there, and this one up to about here. And as you can see, that's brightened her face up quite a bit. So it has also brightened up this patch behind her, which I didn't necessarily want brightened up. So what I'm going to do, you can see the layer mask here is white. I'm going to grab my black brush again, and I'm just going to brush the oh, excuse me, just going to brush the levels layer off that back corner. All right, then I'm going to next add a curves layer, just to add a tiny bit more contrast. So I'm going to go same little circle icon and choose curves adjustment layer. And all I'm going to do here is just pull this one down a tiny bit here, just to add a little bit more contrast, and then push it up just a tiny bit there. And you'll see the difference that this makes is really subtle, but it just adds that little bit more contrast and depth to the image. Having done that, I think I'm now going to duplicate. Let me just see. Yeah, I think I'm going to duplicate that levels layer. So I'm going to go Control J. You can also do that how I did earlier in the beginning and go layer, new, layer by copy. And as you can see now, she's like far too bright, but what I'm going to do is bring the opacity on that layer down to around 30%. It's kind of given me an extra layer of the levels, but at a weaker strength. So I actually think that's pretty close to how I want it. Now I have a couple of actions which I run on her eyes and her skin, which are actions that I've created myself, but I'm going to explain those to you. I'm just going to go layer, flatten image. Right, so down here basically, you can see I've also got lots of actions. The eyes one that I like to use is, you use the Adobe Camera Filter, Camera Raw Filter. In fact, I'll just do that so I can show you. Okay, so because I need to do this on a new layer. So we'll go Control J or Command J to create a new layer, filter, Camera Raw Filter. Now the idea with this is to sharpen her eyes. I really want to increase the contrast and increase the clarity, and then also the sharpening. So in here, this basically opens up a panel that looks a little bit like the Lightroom panel. The difference is that I can brush this on where I want it and where I don't want it. So I'm just going to bring the clarity up, and I'm going to bring the contrast up. And I'm also going to add just a tiny exposure boost, just a really little one. Just there. And then I'm going to jump down here to detail and just grab sharpening and bring sharpening quite a long way up. All right, now as you can see, that's made the rest of her face look a bit funky as well, which is not the effect that we're after, but that's okay because we can mask that off. Just bring that clarity up a tiny bit more. All right, so we're going to go OK to add those changes to our image. As you can see, she's now like way over contrasted in other areas of the image. So we're going to pop a layer mask on, and then I'm going to go Control I just to invert that layer mask, which basically just hides it. And then I can choose a white brush, make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to bring my brush back up to 100% opacity because I want to brush like the full effect on over here. I'm going to zoom in so I'm nice and close, and then I'm just going to brush that sharpening and contrast over her eyes like that. And that one there, I can see myself in her eyes where I was shooting. All right, so there you go, and you can see over here in the layer mask where I've brushed that on. I'm going to zoom out just to take a look at her eyes. We can turn it off to see, turn it back on. Yes, I'm happy with that. Just a little bit more at the top there. All right, so now that I'm happy with it, I might actually just bring the strength of that down a little bit. It's a little bit stronger than I wanted it, so maybe down to about there. I'm just going to run a smoothing action in a similar way. So layer flatten, a smoothing action in a similar way just to smooth her skin a tiny bit. I have both of these saved as actions that I've created, but I'm just going to show you how I do it using the Camera Raw filter. So, where's it gone? Camera Raw filter. The actions just save time. It's essentially the same process. It just means it's a one-click adjustment. So we're going to do the opposite to what we did with the eyes. We're going to bring the clarity down here, not too much because I don't want her skin to lose all of its clarity and texture. And we're going to bring the contrast down a tiny bit also. Just like that. All right, and then we're going to go OK. And as you can see, that has softened her eyes, all of her face. We don't want her whole face soft. So I'm going to again pop a layer mask on, Control I to invert it, grab my white brush at 100% opacity, make it a little bit bigger because I want it to be nice and big and soft, and then just brush that smoothing on over her cheeks and nose. I'm going to avoid her lips because I don't want them to lose the detail. Just a little bit on her forehead, and again not going anywhere near her eyes because I want them to stay nice and sharp. Make it a little bit smaller so I can come a little bit closer around her nose there, and that just gives a very soft, a very subtle smoothing effect to her skin. You can see there, just a tiny bit, just yeah, really subtle. All right, so I'm happy with how that looks. I'm now going to bring my image back to Lightroom to save it, and also to, I think the easiest and quickest way to get rid of this is just to use a grad filter in Lightroom. So I'm going to go File, Save. You can see down here that that's saving my image. And that'll bring it back into Adobe Lightroom here. It'll pop up in a stack as a duplicate of the original image. And then I'm just going to, as I mentioned, just to darken the side over here, I'm just going to grab a grad filter. I'm going to pop it on here. Whoa. Stretch it out a little bit. Just see where it's at. Turn it around a little bit. I obviously don't want it to go too far because I don't want it to get her face. And I also want it to be quite natural looking. I don't want it to look like it's, you know, it's too harsh. So I'm just going to, yeah, go like that. Maybe bring that out that way a little bit. Tilt it around there. Get back off her face a tiny bit. All right, and then I'm just going to bring the exposure down slightly. I'll turn the mask overlay off so I can actually see what I'm doing. I'm just going to bring the exposure down slightly on that back corner. And then I'm going to bring the shadows down on it as well. And I'm just going to concentrate it a little bit more. Bring it in there like that. Perfect. Bring the exposure down a little bit more. And the shadows down a little bit more. Tilt it. Again, this is something I could fiddle with for ages, but right for now it's going to be good enough. All right, that's done. So that's just kind of darkened out some of the distraction. I might just grab a brush, an adjustment brush. Again, reduce the exposure quite a bit. And just, oh, I don't want it to be that big though. Where is it? Where's my brush size? Here. Just bring my brush size down. And just brush that on. Just to darken. Oh, no, don't like that. Edit. Undo. No, that's going to look nasty. Right. Nope, I think I'm actually going to leave that as it is. All right, so I am fairly happy with how that's looking now. I'm ready to export it. So yeah, that's how I would edit this image. Happy editing.